This technique sample is called a top stitch. So go ahead and cut out a swatch of fabric to get started. And the first step is you're just gonna sew a plain seam. So this is good practice to remember what's a plain seam. Well, a seam is 2 pieces of fabric, right? Okay, so we're gonna sew these 2 back together. We need to do right side together. We need to line up our raw edge, pin it together, and we're gonna do a 1/2 inch seam allowance today. Okay, so I will take it to the sewing machine and I'm gonna start here at the top and I'll back stitch and I'll sew straight down. When I get to the bottom, I'll back stitch. I'll keep an eye that my raw edge is staying on that engraved line next to the 1/2 mark, and my stitch length is medium. So here I go. Okay, so to sew our top stitch, we need to start with just a plain seam. So I'm gonna line up the raw edge under the 1/2 inch mark. I'm gonna go ahead and sew. I need to back stitch. I'm gonna finish sewing a straight line, keeping that raw edge next to the 1/2 inch. Get to the bottom and back stitch. Make sure our take-up lever is in the highest position so that we can pull out our fabric, always pulling by pulling it behind the machine so that we don't risk bending our needle. Okay, and we have just sewn a plain seam. So now for the top stitch part. So here is our plain seam. So now I haven't ironed it to press open my seam allowances because I'm gonna sew a top stitch. So instead of pressing open the seam allowance, I'm gonna press all of the seam allowance to one side. And then that one side that it's pressed to, I'm gonna sew parallel to my seam line. So you're gonna see my top stitch once I'm done. Let me go give this a quick press. Okay, so now I'm just gonna sew. I'm gonna take this to the machine and I'm basically gonna sew parallel to my seam line. I'll back stitch at the top and just sew straight down. And you are gonna see this thread. So your thread color does matter because it will be seen. So some people like to do a matching thread, like in this case, maybe a white or a blue thread. Other people might wanna do a fun contrast thread, like bright red or bright yellow or something. So that's totally up to you. Having these 2 rows of stitches makes this seam double strong, right? Because we have a 1 stitch sewing them together, we've got another one. So you see this kind of stitch in like accessories or luggage or denim clothing, just kind of more tough stuff that you just don't want the seam to break. And then it's also a cool like aesthetic design detail because then you really see the lines of the seams and sometimes a pop of color as well. So okay, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this to the machine and give it a top stitch. Okay, so I'm at the machine, I'm ready to sew my top stitch. Now there are different lengths of the distance of where you can put your top stitch in relationship to your seam. If you sew really close to your seam, like about 1/16 of an inch, that is called an edge stitch, which is actually our next technique sample. If you sew it a little bit further, like a 1/4 inch, and in my case, I definitely don't want it more than 1/2 inch because then it won't catch my seam allowance. Then that's usually just referred to as a regular top stitch. Sometimes people will top stitch like 5/8 inch wide, 1/2 inch, 3/8, 1/4 inch. But when you hear the word edge stitch, you know it's really close to the seam. So this is a top stitch today. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna line up my seam that I already sewed to the edge of my presser foot. And I'm gonna use that as a guide to sew a straight line. I'm gonna measure the distance, okay? It looks like if I do that in this case, I will be sewing with a 1/4 inch top stitch. So that sounds good to me. Okay, again, we want this to stay in forever, so I will be back stitching. There, okay, back stitch, great. Just keeping an eye on my seam that it stays aligned with my presser foot so that my top stitch will look nice and straight. We don't want to sew over our pins, you know. I have seen them break and come flying in students' faces, so be sure to take it out before the needle comes. And okay, let's get to the end and back stitch. Great. To take it out, again, we need to make sure that take-up lever is in the highest position. Okay, I just moved it up so the take-up lever is in the highest position. So now it is ready for the presser foot to be lifted up and pull out towards the back and trim our threads. Great, and that's it. Voila, we have a top stitch.